All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I apologize, there's no slides. I upgraded my phone operating system from 16 to 18, and now it's not communicating with it, so I'll hopefully get it figured out. So I'll describe my slides to you so that you can know what we're looking at. There's a few of them. Maybe we can show you next class. So let's go to God in a word of prayer before we start. Yahweh, our God and Father, we are so thankful for the chance we have to study your word together. We ask that you would open our hearts and minds and show us the things that you would have us to learn as we study from the book of Daniel. Help us, make us the people that you would have us to be. It's in Jesus that we pray. Amen. All right, so we're getting into chapter 4 tonight. Daniel chapter 4. And that's lesson 7. So tonight we'll be covering most of the events of the story, and then Sunday we'll talk about finishing up some of those events, and then we'll also talk about applications for us. There's a lot of applications for us in this class. I'm not going to be here Sunday. We're going to Tennessee to get a little bit of fall weather and enjoy that, so I'm looking forward to that, but I really wish I was going to be here to teach the class because there's a lot of good applications for us that I would like to talk about. But Ryan's going to teach that class for us. I've given him my notes, so if you get something that's really off in left field, it's him, it's not my notes. So. And there's a few slides I actually would like you to see that I can't show you tonight. Ryan, I'll forward these things to you too, and maybe you could pull a few of them out just so you can show them. There's some of the discovered archaeology that I think would be helpful. So I wish you could see them tonight because it's a few really cool things, but we'll get by without it. People have learned the Bible for years and years without slides to look at, so we can certainly do that. All right. So right now you're not looking at a slide that says author, timing, purpose of this chapter. So that's what we're going to talk about. It's got a wonderful piece of art on it that shows Nebuchadnezzar asleep and this kind of dreamy looking giant tree behind him. So just kind of picture that. And let's look at question 1. I ask you, who wrote this chapter of Daniel? Nebuchadnezzar. What seems surprising about that? He's not a Jew. Definitely not a Jew. Yeah, so the rest of the book is written by Daniel, so it's somebody different in this book of Daniel that's included in the middle of it. Yeah. Yeah, he's writing this chapter, and he's actually the one in the wrong in this chapter. Would that be common for a king? Would it be common for any leader anywhere? But especially in the Eastern countries in that day and time, would that be common at all? What do we know about how their history was typically written? Much like our history. It's in their favor, yeah. And so only good things about the kings were recorded. In fact, when you read historical accounts that the kings wrote about their, the countries they conquered and things like that, it's always a little bit over the top, and you can kind of tell it's probably not all completely accurate because they make themselves look so good in it. So it'd be very unusual for a king of that day and time to write something negative about himself. That's just not how they recorded history at all. What else? Thinking about the person, what else seems unusual that Nebuchadnezzar wrote this, thinking about the kind of person that we've seen him to be? Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that, but there's some inspiration if it's included in here. Has he been, what we know about him, has he been the kind of guy you'd think would write a chapter in the Bible? He's a warrior. He's brutal. He's been opposed to God's people. Jenny? Yeah. So it all seems surprising to see a chapter, and I'm not aware of anything else in the Bible that's really, in this regard, that's written this way. We're going to see another chapter later in Daniel that's very different from every chapter in the Bible as well. So this is very unusual. But from the wording throughout it, it's clear that he's the author. Now, maybe he did this through Daniel. Maybe it was a kind of a joint thing, and he told Daniel what to write. We don't know. But it's recorded as being from him. So it may help us maybe to think about question 2 along these lines. Why did God allow this to be written and recorded by him? And maybe thinking along those same lines, what was the purpose of this illness that he had and then him being restored? Guthrie?
First-hand account of the event. It's not third-hand or second-hand where
Yeah, so it's a first-hand account of the things that happened. That's part of why it's recorded this way, I'm sure.
He might not have been delivered, but that's right. He did well.
Yeah, he's Yeah, he became a believer. We're going to talk about that some, hopefully at the end of class, and Ryan's going to talk about that more. But he, at least to some degree, is a very strong believer now comparatively. So it shows this transition that we've been seeing in him across 4 chapters now. And I gave you some verses there. What's the recognition that he openly states, that's stated over and over and over? Jenny? Yeah. Carl? Yeah, that God is in control. And specifically here, it's over those who rule, right? I mean, if you look at verse... I just accidentally changed chapters there. If you look at verse 17 that I put down there, this decision, it goes on, in order that the living may know. Who's the living? Everybody, right? That's everybody here on the earth. So it's not just for Nebuchadnezzar. It's not just for Daniel. It's not just for the people of that time. It says, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowest of men. So maybe taking somebody who was one of the greatest world rulers and having him write a chapter helps us to understand that even more clearly, that he recognized that and he saw it. And so it for all of us, it lets the living know that God puts people where he wants to, lifts them up and takes them down. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Right. Yeah, and because there's not much of that in the Bible, we'll talk about this more as we talk about where he lands, and that's part of the lesson that comes on Sunday, although we may talk about that at the end of this one. But we kind of forget about the Gentiles really throughout the Old Testament, right? It's really a storyline that leads us up to Jesus, and then the Gentiles are incorporated in the New Testament. So there's a whole part of mankind's history that's really not recorded for us because it's not pertinent to the Savior coming. But this shows some of what you just said, that he's interested in everybody's salvation. He's interested in everybody, even the non-Jewish nations. And so we get to see a little glimpse of that here. So one of those reasons, well, we've talked about several. Do you see some other reasons in those verses? Yeah, he definitely wasn't a guy that was humble, was he? He's not humble at all, but he is humbled by God. And he learns and recognizes from that. So it shows us, it also, one of the reasons it was recorded perhaps is because it shows us the ultimate of somebody who's proud and has reason to be proud from a human standpoint, being brought low, and there's lessons for us in that. So does this event with Nebuchadnezzar still aid us today? How so? We'll talk about some applications again on Sunday, so we're not going to get too deep into it, but how does that help us today? Is it just kind of a neat story? Jenny? Mm-hmm. Very good, Catherine. Yeah. So there's a lot of applications, and again, we'll talk about that more on Sunday and how those apply to us. It's one thing to see it learned by Nebuchadnezzar. It's far more important for us to learn from that and make those applications in our lives. And we'll talk about that more on Sunday. But that's just to kind of start to get our wheels turning about. There's probably we don't know what they are, but there's got to be reasons why God had Nebuchadnezzar write this chapter as opposed to just having Daniel record it from his perspective. That it's actually written by him. All right, so let's look at verse 4. So the timing of this. It says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in my house and flourishing in my palace. So some of the visions, most of them were actually told when it happened, in the first year of this king and the third year of this king. This one we don't really know exactly when it happened. But Nebuchadnezzar's early reign, we know from history, was full of military conquest. Even though he was the king, there was a lot of military conquest. We talked earlier about in the third year he was at battle with Syria when he had the initial dream about the great statue. So there was a lot of battle going on early, military conquest, establishing stability of his country. His years of building the structure of the city came in the latter part of his reign. So this was, the wording would imply that this was actually late in the building period, so probably somewhere towards the end of his 43-year reign. So I'll talk more about that in just a minute. Let me give you just a little bit of history. There's 3 slides that you're not going to be looking at that are really cool. One of them actually shows the Ishtar Gate. It's a gate that's been excavated, and it's a small portion of it, but it's really big. When you see the people, they look really little, but it's actually the small portion of the Ishtar Gate. It's got these beautiful blue ceramic bricks on the front of it with all kinds of animals, lions. I can't tell what they all are here because this is too small, but it's actually a picture of that gate that's been excavated and reconstructed at the Pergamum Museum in Berlin. And then the slide after that shows an artist rendition of what the city would look like from the outside. There's a couple of those, and one of them actually shows the Ishtar Gate and the entrance area there. But what we'll talk about now is a little bit of backdrop, the history of Babylon. So I'm going to do a little bit of talking here, and we'll come back to some of the questions. But if you think about it, because of the military conquest, remember how big Babylon was, that it was along the Euphrates River and down through Judea into Egypt. It was a large empire that they built by conquering. Because of that, they would have absorbed the wealth of all those other countries. They're in charge and in control, and so the wealth of those countries would pour into them. And that was funneled, for the most part, into the city of Babylon. That's where the capital was. And so he put a lot of effort into building that into a great city. According to Herodotus, how's that pronounced? Okay, Herodotus, the historian, he wrote in the 450 to 428 BC era. So this is coming roughly 100 years within the downfall of Babylon. There are also writings from the physician and historian Ctesias. I don't want to say it the wrong way. Ctesias. Okay, then I can say it however I want. Ctesias of Cnidus. He began writing 398 BC, so he wrote a little bit later, but the 2 closest historians we have to that time frame. So there's some information that they give us about Babylon. Some of that is here on your question sheet because I want you to kind of see a little bit about that. But Herodotus reported that the walls were 14 miles long on each side, 300 feet tall, 25 feet wide, 35-foot deep foundation. I mean, that's impressive even with today's standards, but think about it back then. There were 250 sentinel towers that were 450 feet high, so I would assume they went 150 feet above the city wall so that they could see things that were coming from a distance. And then there was a second wall inside of that one to help protect the city in case the outer wall was breached. The whole city was surrounded by a deep moat, and there was only one entrance. It had a bridge that was actually partial drawbridge so they could retract it at night or when enemies were coming. And that bridge was reportedly a half-mile long. So the whole drawbridge wasn't, but the bridge itself that was elevated was a half-mile long. So you can imagine it would be hard to get anybody into that area if you were trying to conquer or attack the city. They had ferries that ran only in the daytime. They had hanging gardens there that are still considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. I don't know how we know that, but that's what's been recorded. The streets were paved with large stone slabs, so not just dirt roads, but actually paved with large stone slabs. And there were temples all throughout the city. So a few other things that are in addition to that Herodotus recorded, as well as the other guy that I mentioned. I'm not going to try to repronounce his name. But that second wall was 75 feet inside of the outer wall. So it doesn't leave a lot of room to amass forces. If you breach it, it's far enough also, though, that you're not breaching both walls at the same time. So that would really be difficult for somebody attacking it. The Euphrates River ran through the middle of the city, so they had a water supply. So even if somebody tried to surround them, they've got their water coming into the city. We'll see next chapter that ended up being the downfall later on. But the water was raised from the river by hydraulic pumps. So probably animal driven, but they knew how to make hydraulic pumps so they could actually raise water, and that watered the plants of the city. The stone slabs in the streets were 3-foot squares. There was a ziggurat, which is a kind of tall, skinny, pyramid-shaped tower in the center of the city, and then 53 other ornate temples, including the great temple of Marduk. Marduk was the god of Babylon. There were also 180 altars to Ishtar in the city. Ishtar is the goddess of war and of fertility. So they had 180 altars to Ishtar in the city. There was an enormous golden image of Baal and an impressive golden table that both weighed over 50,000 pounds of gold, according to the historians, and 2 massive golden lions and an 18-foot tall high golden human figure, which I don't know, but maybe that was, again, from his dream, and that kind of inspired the making of that. We don't know. Nebuchadnezzar's palace was considered the most magnificent building ever built at that time. The bricks of the city were glazed in yellow, blue, and red hues, so that there were brilliant color throughout the city as well. So that's just a little bit of impressive about the architecture. So you can imagine putting yourself in that kind of a setting. We think of the old cities and think of all the bricks that we uncover with the dirt on them, and that's not the way it looked when they lived there. They looked different at that. That's what's left over at this point in time. Let's think a little bit about his military might. His military leadership was almost unstoppable. He was a brilliant strategist and a fearless leader. Remember, he broke Egypt's power at the Battle of Carchemish. We talked about that in the first lesson. So that was when he established his empire, and that was 606 BC. And then he brought under control Syria, Phoenicia, Palestine, Tyre, Moab, Ammon, Edom, and ultimately Judah. So a lot of nations that he conquered in that process. In his 37th year, Egypt tried to rebel, and he marched against Egypt and inflicted heavy damage on Egypt again when they tried to rebel against his rule. So Nebuchadnezzar ruled over the most beautiful and the most costly city that had ever been built. He was the most powerful military on earth, and he reigned over the most extensive empire that the earth had known at that point in time. So thinking back to why he might be proud, I mean, from a human standpoint, does this guy have reason to be proud? I mean, he's accomplished probably more than any other human being to that point in time from a, leadership standpoint. We talked about this a little bit in the first lesson about, and rolling into the second one, I think, how people try to, critics of the Bible, because of some of the prophecies we're going to look at, have tried to look at things that are stated in the book of Daniel and say, well, that's not true. So for a long time, there wasn't proof that Nebuchadnezzar had actually built the city's grandeur. Nobody knew all that. So it was talked about here in Daniel chapter 4, but there was nothing in history about it, about him being the one that built it. And so everybody claimed it was a mistake in the book, that it was just something kind of made up. But archaeological discoveries have actually proven that we have. So like the Ishtar Gate is one of those things. So for years and years, that was a claim against the book of Daniel, but now it's been proven that it's true. What's kind of interesting, I was talking with somebody about this, a lot of the old claims that people used to make against the book, even though we found archaeological proof that it's just not true, such as we'll talk about Belshazzar in the next chapter, that there's clear proof that he exists. People that want to criticize the Bible still make those same claims. They'll still say there's not proof of this happening, there's not proof of a Belshazzar, when there's plenty of archaeological proof about it. So it's because it's been written about in the past, those claims still get carried over. Much like today, people just hang on to things because they don't want to believe in God or don't want to believe his word, that they'll believe in things that are clearly not true. So that still happens with people that want to try to disprove the book of Daniel. But like we talked about also in the first lesson, the fact that Daniel recorded these things, then you've got Herodotus and Ctesias, who just 100 years, 150 years later didn't know that it was Nebuchadnezzar that actually did all of the building of the city. And then when we uncover it, there's actually archaeological proof it was there. That kind of proves that Daniel actually wrote it in the time frame that he says that he did, because it was lost to history in the interim. Does that make sense? Otherwise, those historians would have known that. And so the fact that just 100 years later they had lost that information, but Daniel had recorded it, proves that he couldn't have written it after the fact. He had to have written it when it was actually happening. So just another one of those things that really prove it. But here's some of the archaeological proof. There are bricks that bear his name and ascribe the buildings to him having built them. Obviously, he wasn't the one that actually physically built them, but it was under his direction and charge. So there's bricks that have that on it. Some of the claims on the building inscriptions are actually outlandish. They equate him with being one of the gods and attributing all the wealth of the world even to himself. So again, kind of that Asian, the Asian king of that era mindset. There's one of the imprints on bricks or on a building that reads the fortifications of Esagila, which is the temple of Marduk. The fortifications of Esagila and Babylon I strengthened and established the name of my reign forever. So that's a pretty strong statement, but it shows that he wrote it. And there's one sense in which that's kind of true, because here we are, 2,500 years later, and we still know about him and what he built. So there's a sense in which he really did establish that in a forever from the world standpoint. There's an inscription on the Ishtar Gate that reads, that's Nebuchadnezzar, I laid the foundation of the gates down to the groundwater level and had them built out of pure blue stone. I covered their roofs by laying majestic cedars lengthwise over them. I hung doors of cedar adorned with bronze at all the gate openings. I placed wild bulls and ferocious dragons in the gateways, and thus adorned them with luxurious splendor that people might gaze on them and wonder. And so it sounds like he's describing, the things you actually see on the Ishtar Gate there when you see the picture of that. So those are all proofs that he actually built the city, because he's got all those inscriptions that were placed all over and on a lot of the bricks. And some of the bricks actually have that inscription to him on like multiple bricks in the same building. It's not just a single brick like we would put a plaque on a building. It's like all the bricks were formed with that on them. So we'll talk about his pride mostly in the next class. So we're going to talk more about just the events of the chapter today. But that's the backdrop of the city and the nation that was built primarily on his military conquest and his economic growth and his building plan for the city. So it gives you a little backdrop to what he had accomplished. So now the slide you're not looking at says the dream and Chaldeans. So that's what we're going to be talking about. It's got a really cool artistic picture of this giant tree with all these really funky looking fruits all over it, and these animals that look really small underneath because the tree's so big. All right, so let's look at question 3. I ask you to describe Nebuchadnezzar's dream of chapter 4. So what's his dream? It says shelter for all the animals of the earth, right? And then what else does the tree provide? Food. Yeah, it's got all the fruits on it for everyone. What else? What happens? Yeah, there's angelic watchers that come and say they're going to chop it down. And why do they say? It also says to leave the stump and the roots in the earth, right? So they're not uprooting the whole tree, but they're leaving the stump and the roots, bound with a band of iron and bronze. And it says, let it be wet with the dew of heaven. Let him graze with the beasts, as you were just talking about. Let his heart be changed from that of a man to the heart of a beast. And then for how long? 7 times, right? Some translations may say years, but I think that just means 7 times. It's not necessarily years, so we'll talk about that in a minute. And then it ends by saying this decision is by the decree. This is what he heard in his dream, right? This decision is by the decree of the watchers and sentenced by the word of the holy ones. Why? We just talked about it. In order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets over at the lowest of men. So that's the dream that he had. So let's look at question 4. I ask, why do you think this particular dream made Nebuchadnezzar, depending on the translation you have, these are the words from the primary translations, afraid, fearful, terrified, alarmed, troubled. Those are strong words, but depending on what translation you have, it says one of those. Yes. Yeah, he's got a feeling about what this is about. Yeah. And he kind of knows it's him, right? Even though he doesn't say this is Nebuchadnezzar, it's this tree that's providing for everything. He knows that's kind of the position he's in, so he probably realizes it's about him. And in the ancient cultures, a tree was often actually a symbol for a king, too. So even though we don't use it that way, that was a common symbol in a lot of the ancient cultures of that area. And so that probably would have made him think even more so, hey, this represents me. And so he sees there's something bad happening here, but he doesn't know exactly what it means, right? But he's got this feeling, okay, this is about me. It's pretty clear he's the tree. And it's pretty clear there's something ominous or bad going to happen. They're going to chop it down. And it says he's going to be given a heart of a beast and live in the fields and eat the grass. So he doesn't know exactly what it means. He doesn't know exactly how bad it is, but he's clearly got a feeling this is about me and it's not good, but he wants to know what it means. So going back to verses 6 through 8, why would he have called his other counselors first rather than going straight to Daniel? Because he knows Daniel can tell him, right? When Daniel shows up in verse 18, he says, I know you can tell me. Why would he have called the other counselors first? Okay, to test them might be a reason. We're not told why, so it's a little bit of just kind of sing into it. To see if they would tell him. Yeah, well, maybe you wanted to hear what anybody had to say about it. So maybe he wants them to tell him something good. Why? So maybe stepping aside from that, why wouldn't they tell him something good about it? But why didn't they say something good then? Why didn't they say, well, this is not about you, it's about somebody else? Or why do you think maybe they wouldn't tell him something? Again, we don't know. I would say one thing is clearly in verse 18, he knows Daniel knows the answer, right? And so if they tell him something that's not true and Daniel comes along and says something different, that's going to put him on the line. And if what they say doesn't come true, that's going to put their heads on the line, right? So maybe they just realize, okay, we don't want to tell him the bad news. It's about him. We're not going to make up bad things, so we're not going to tell. Maybe part of the reason he didn't go straight to Daniel, too, is maybe Daniel wasn't handy. Daniel was very high in the kingdom, so maybe he was off on business somewhere else temporarily. Or maybe he just wasn't handy immediately. He wasn't there in the palace, and he had to wait on him till later in the day to show up. We don't know. But he asked the people, the counselors that are there. Ryan? Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I'm not quite following what your point is. Oh, the original dream about another kingdom coming. Yeah.
But there may have been some doubt still on whether that was actually going to be what that dream was.
Okay, yeah, so because the first dream had been fulfilled. So that actually maybe is a good tie-in. Let me look at my notes here. Well, let's kind of tie that into the next question. Let's look at question 5, because I think that kind of ties into another point. Why might Nebuchadnezzar have told all his counselors this dream? Remember back in chapter 2, he didn't tell them the dream. He said, you got to tell me the dream and the meaning. That way I know you know what you're talking about. So why would he have told the dream here? Why not do the same thing? Desperation might be. I mean, we don't know, but there's some things I think we can suppose. Kind of,
He knew he had an outlet to get
from Daniel.
He knew that Daniel
Yeah.
would know what it was.
Because back in chapter 2, Daniel told him what his dream was, right? He knew Daniel could do that. And also because of what he says in verse 18, and we're many years later, it's not recorded for us, but it seems pretty clear from the wording that these aren't the only dreams Daniel had interpreted. Because we're told back in the end of chapter 1 that Daniel was given the power to interpret dreams and visions. So probably Nebuchadnezzar's actually seen that happening at other times too. Again, not recorded for us, maybe a little bit of supposition there, but what he says in verse 18 makes it pretty clear that he knows Daniel can interpret dreams. He doesn't have any question about that at this point. So probably that's been something, because otherwise why would we be told in chapter 1 that Daniel had the ability to interpret dreams and visions, and there's only 2 of them recorded here. There's probably other ones that he interpreted as well. But he knows Daniel can tell him. He knew Daniel could interpret it. He knew if the other wise men made up something that wasn't accurate, Daniel could give him the right answer. He knew at a minimum from chapter 2, Daniel had told him what his dream was, as well as the meaning, and so he knew Daniel got this power from God. So that maybe explains why he told everybody the dream, because he knew there was an outlet to actually find the answer. All right. So now we're looking at a slide. You're not. This says Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar, and it's this giant, giant tree stump that's cut off on the top, and all these animals that are really small in the field around it. Again, a really cool artistic rendition. So again, I know we all know this, but what's the background for Daniel? Why was he in Babylon in the first place? What had happened to his country? They'd been taken over, yeah. In the beginning of the book, they had only taken away captives and taken some of the temple stuff. We're later on now in Nebuchadnezzar's reign. At this point, their whole country's been wiped out. There's no Jerusalem anymore. It's been destroyed. The temple's been destroyed. So that's the background. What would be the natural inclination for somebody of Daniel's race to have towards Nebuchadnezzar? Bitterness, yeah. I mean, I think any of us would feel that. If somebody came and destroyed our country, took us captive somewhere else, we're probably going to be pretty bitter towards their leader and all of their government. Even if they put us in a higher position, there's going to be some bitterness there because they changed our life so much in a negative way. So that would seem natural. Yeah, let's look at Daniel 4:19. So Daniel comes in, and Nebuchadnezzar asks him to explain the dream, and it says, Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for a time, and his thoughts troubled him. So the king spoke and said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation trouble you. Belteshazzar answered and said, My lord, may the dream concern those who hate you, and its interpretation concern your enemies. So question 6 points out Daniel responded to this dream in kind of a surprising way. So what can you conclude about Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar from that? Yes. Yeah, so there's concern and compassion for Nebuchadnezzar, and he goes on to tell him the truth in just a moment. So those things all tell us, what do they tell us about the relationship between these two guys? There seems to be a closeness of some sort of trust. It's more than just he's the boss I can't stand, but I work for him and do a really good job because that's what I'm supposed to do. There seems to be some relationship here. We don't really know why, but just a few things to think about. This is most assuredly late in Nebuchadnezzar's 43-year reign. It's not at the beginning because of what we know about history and when he would have been in his palace. So at this point, they've been working together for a long time. They've been working together for some 40 years since Daniel interpreted the first dream. Probably not quite that many because his reign was 43 years and this is not at the very end of it, but they've been working together for 20, 30 years at least. And it seems pretty clear Daniel has grown to appreciate at least some aspects of Nebuchadnezzar as who he is. Maybe certainly not everything, but some of them. There appears to be a close working relationship here because of the response, not just a boss and a well-compensated employee. Also, I think it would seem to me the fact that we've seen Nebuchadnezzar changing. If you think back in chapter 1, he recognized that these three guys plus Daniel were the wisest that there were. Chapter 2, he says, your God is the God of gods because he could interpret the dream. Chapter 3 with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he now steps up and says nobody can say anything bad about their God. And now we see what he says in this chapter. So there's been a change in opening that he's open to who this God is, and so Daniel's going to know that about him. And so that probably is part of the appreciation as well. Jonathan?
It may also be that Daniel rightly sees that Nebuchadnezzar was a tool of God. In essence, that he was sent there for a purpose. The fall of Judah was something that God wished, and Nebuchadnezzar would be used by him. And so even in the first dream, shows that Nebuchadnezzar has a role to play in all this stuff. So it might be that he shows respect for God in that.
Yeah. Yeah, he's certainly, no question, showing respect for God and showing that respect for Nebuchadnezzar. There's no question about that. Maybe he recognized, as you said, that Nebuchadnezzar was a tool for God. Most of us, I don't think, would recognize that in this situation. We'd realize that person's growing, but I think we would probably still step back and say, well, they've got a long way to go, but they're learning. But yeah, maybe he actually recognized God's using me in this role, God's using Nebuchadnezzar also. Yeah.
Well, I don't know how it works too, or if instantly understood the interpretation of the dream, or if it wasn't until Nebuchadnezzar told him that it came to him. But the events that he described in the first dream would have been something that could be under nations conquering nations. That's something that the people around could understand.
Mm-hmm.
But the events he describes in this dream, that a world leader is going to crawl around in the grass like an animal, and after it's done, he's going to get be in his role, and the people will accept him and come back to him. It's such a crazy.
Yes, it's crazy.
Say, and I'm sure even for him it was a shocking revelation.
Yeah, because we'll talk about this again in a little bit on Sunday too. You're never going to let a leader who goes senile come back and lead again, right? That's just, I mean, seriously, you're not going to do that. Nobody's going to do that. So, kind of like I was saying also, the fact it's been some over 30 years since Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel started working together, and the fact that he is absolutely confident Daniel can interpret the dream. There's probably been other dreams that he's seen him interpret in that interim as well. And also, as Brianna pointed out a minute ago, when you look in verse 27, the fact that he gives him advice on what to do, unsolicited, tells him you need to repent, that shows probably that there's some closeness there too, because it's not wording that would probably, I mean, we didn't see that with his wording earlier on when he talked to Nebuchadnezzar. He just kind of told him what things meant. But here he actually makes application, says, please repent so that this stuff doesn't happen to you. So that shows a closeness as well. So I asked you in question 7 to summarize the interpretation of the dream. What was that interpretation? Yes? Yeah, so and he goes, he specifically tells him, you're the tree, right? You're the great tree. The whole world is fed by you. You're protection for everybody. It's you, O king. In verse 22, has grown and become strong. And then he goes on in verse 23 and says, with what you saw them chopping it down, this is the interpretation that is going to come upon you. They'll drive you from men. Your dwelling will be with beasts. You'll be wet with the dew of heaven. So he's giving him some really harsh, here's what's going to happen to you, and this is really bad. You're going to live like an animal. But in verse 26, inasmuch as they left the stump and the roots, it's going to be given back to you. And then in verse 27 is when he goes on to say, please repent, do good, so that maybe these things don't come upon you. So now we'll talk about his illness for a few minutes before we end class. And the slide that you're not seeing says the illness, and it's got this guy with long hair and looks kind of animalistic down on his hands and knees out in the grass. That's what you're not looking at. So we'll talk about this a little bit more, and especially talk about his pride in the next class. Ryan's going to cover his pride, and then we're going to spend some time making applications for us out of this chapter. But I asked you in question 8, what was the humiliating mental illness that he was stricken with? We don't know what it was, but I mean, we know how he acted, right? He thought he was an animal. He literally thought he was an animal. He lived like an animal. He ate grass. He's out in the field. And they treated him like that, right? And think how humiliating that is. I mean, none of us want to lose our mental capacities. And that's a tough thing to face when we realize, anybody that realizes that's starting to slip, it's a tough thing to face. So, to have somebody of this power and magnitude be told you're going to actually think you're an animal and live like one, and then it actually happens. It's extremely humiliating to him. So he's out in the field like an animal, eating grass, out in the weather, rain, cold, whatever the weather would be. Probably not a whole lot of cold in that part of the world, but hair uncut, nails growing untrimmed. It's just an animal out there. This is, again, an area where critics have pushed on it, so there's no documented evidence. There's nothing in the historical accounts that tell us that anything like this happened to Nebuchadnezzar. And that's true. There's not any record of those things having happened. They also point out, well, his kingdom would have been restored to him if this had really happened. And again, that's true also, but it shows God's in control. He's the one that raises men up and brings men down and brings up the lowest and puts them in position. But again, as I was pointing out, official recordings of countries of that part of the world only recorded the good things that happened, not all the pitfalls and problems. Again, not unlike us. When you look at U.S. history, we leave a lot of the bad stuff out, and we just talk about, a little bit of it's in there, but we don't put everything in that's really happened. We make ourselves look good when we record our history. In 1975, there was an Assyriologist, somebody who studies Assyria, published a cuneiform text from the British Museum that was, it mentions Nebuchadnezzar and evil Merodach, who was his son and successor. And only the backside of that's readable, but it refers to Nebuchadnezzar giving evil Merodach certain orders, and the son doesn't heed them based on the king's erratic behavior. And the quote is, he does not show love to son or daughter, family clan does not exist, his attention was not directed towards promoting the welfare of Esagil, which again is the temple to Marduk, and Babylon. And so that's not proof, but it correlates with his mental illness, that his son wouldn't take orders from him when he was in the position of being a king. There was a Greek historian in 286 that recorded that Nebuchadnezzar had been possessed by some god, that's a quote, and had immediately disappeared. And then here's the thing that I think is really interesting. From 582 to 575 BC, during his reign, there's nothing recorded about anything he did. It's completely silent about Nebuchadnezzar during that time frame. We've got stuff from all the rest of his reign recorded, but there's a time period where there's just nothing recorded at all. So, again, that doesn't prove it, but that sure fits with it very well. So let's talk about the timing a little bit. It says 7 times. So what's that mean? I didn't do that. I don't think that's probably accurate. Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of people that take stuff out of Daniel and try to make a year, each day of a year be a whole nother year. There's all kinds of things that people do to try to come up with things that don't fit. Yeah, so yeah, so that's Yeah, that's a really strong point, is that 7 is a number that in their culture would represent completeness. And not just in the Jewish culture, but in the whole culture. And so it's just a number that means completeness. And so ultimately it says, because it says until you realize your place is what it's saying, it's enough time. It's time enough for him to know that. But as you said, it could have been 7 years, and that would fit the absence of a record. It could just be 7 seasons. The Babylonians actually recorded 2 seasons. Florida, we got 1 season. Up north, there's 4 seasons. But they had a summer and a winter. And so that would have been 3.5 years if that's what it meant. It's unlikely it was 7 months or 7 moon phases, because it wouldn't have been time for his hair and nails to grow out the way that he was described. But it really just means, ultimately, it doesn't matter. It means it took long enough for him to know his place, to realize that God reigned, and to realize who he was and where he was. So it doesn't matter exactly how long, but that just gives us that piece of information. So that's all the stuff I have for tonight, but since we've got, a couple minutes left here? That was first bell, wasn't it? So just a point, Ryan's going to talk about this a little bit Sunday, but so you don't think he's crazy because it's in my notes. I just think it's very intriguing where Nebuchadnezzar landed. We don't know. We ultimately don't know where he stood with God. It's conjecture where he stood with God. But we do see a progression in him. From somebody who didn't even know who Yahweh was, he moves into a place where he says he's the God of gods because he can interpret a dream, and then he protects his name. And here we see him proclaiming him and holding him up, right? So we don't know where that put him. Did he become a Jew? Nothing recorded that would tell us that. But did Gentiles have to become Jews to be saved? No, there was some sort of a different system God had for the Gentiles. We're not told much about that. But can you think of a couple people from the Old Testament that do tell us that? Moses' father-in-law being one of them. Jethro, what was Jethro called? Priest of Midian. And what about somebody that Abraham made sacrifice and paid tithes to? Melchizedek, who was not of Abraham's lineage, so he was not Jewish either, right? So there's some other system that God had with some of the Gentiles that we don't know about. It's possible that Nebuchadnezzar was saved by God. It's possible he wasn't. We don't know the answer to that. I like happy endings, so I kind of like to think that he was, but it's all conjecture on our part. But clearly, we see a growth in what he recognized, and this proclamation he makes, which we'll talk more about on Sunday, is just an amazing proclamation about who God is and what he does, especially when you think it came from the world leader at that point in time. So it's just an amazing proclamation of where God led him. So, all right, thanks for filling in, Ryan. I'll shoot Ryan some of these slides, and maybe he can show them to you on Sunday. Thank you.